Deep in the Amazon rainforest, where no map dares to mark the territory, Kyle pressed his palm against the weathered door of a cabin that shouldn't exist. For 28 years, he had lived as a guardian of North Sentinel Island, trained in the ancient ways of his ancestors who had violently rejected all contact with the outside world for centuries. But 3 months ago, everything changed when strange lights appeared over their sacred waters, and the elders sent him on an impossible mission to find answers in a world his people had sworn to avoid. The cabin's interior reeked of decay and something else, something familiar. His breath caught as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Covering every wall were hundreds of photographs, black and white images of his tribe, his grandfather, his mother as a child, pictures that predated any known contact with outsiders by 50 years. In the center of the room sat a leather journal, its pages yellow with age. The first entry was dated 1923, written in perfect Sentinelese script, a language no outsider had ever learned. But how could someone document his people's most sacred rituals when no stranger had ever set foot on their island and lived? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kyle's hands trembled as he lifted the journal. The leather. The photographs seemed to breathe in the lamplight, their surfaces rippling with shadows as Kyle moved closer. His hands trembled as he reached for the nearest frame, lifting it from the wall with the reverence one might show a sacred relic. The glass was cold against his fingertips, and through it he could see his grandfather Tomac as a young man, standing beside the photographs seemed to breathe in the flickering candlelight, faces shifting and changing with each dance of shadow. Kyle's hands trembled as he lifted another frame from the cluttered table, this one showing his grandfather Tan as a young warrior, painted for the Feast of Deep Waters, a ceremony so sacred that even speaking its name to outsiders meant death. But there were no outsiders on Maeva. There had never been outsiders on Maeva. The glass slipped from his numb fingers, shattering against the wooden floor. In the sudden silence that followed, he heard something that made his blood freeze, footsteps on the cabin's front porch, slow and deliberate. Kyle dropped behind the table, his heart hammering against his ribs. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped directly outside the front door. A key turned in the lock. The door swung open with a prolonged creak, and a figure stepped inside. In the dim light, Kyle could make out a tall, gaunt man wearing clothes unlike anything he'd ever seen, dark fabric that seemed to absorb the candlelight, and strange markings sewn into the sleeves that hurt to look at directly. "I know you're in here, boy." The voice was like wind through dead leaves, speaking Kyle's own language with perfect fluency. "The broken glass gives you away." Kyle pressed himself lower, but the stranger's footsteps approached the table with unsettling certainty. A pale hand appeared at the table's edge, fingers longer than any human hand should be. Kyle, son of Naya, grandson of Tan the Truthkeeper. The stranger's voice carried an amused lilt. "You've grown since the last photographs." The last photographs. Kyle's mind reeled. He forced himself to stand, meeting the stranger's gaze across the table. The man's eyes were the color of deep ocean water, and they seemed to contain depths that went on forever. "Who are you?" Kyle's voice cracked like a child's. "I am Dr. Ezra Blackwood, and I have been documenting your people for 43 years. The man moved to the wall, where Kyle now noticed a map of Maeva drawn in precise detail. Red pins marked locations he recognized. The sacred pools, the ancestral caves, the forbidden grove where only the elders could walk. Your isolation is precious to us. Us? Blackwood gestured to a leather journal lying open on a side table. The pages were covered with notes written in the stranger's spidery handwriting, but the language was Kyle's own. Detailed observations about tribal customs, population counts, genealogical charts that traced bloodlines back generations. The Institute for Anthropological Preservation has been watching your tribe since 1889, Blackwood continued, lighting another candle with a match that flared an unsettling green. "We ensure that your people remain undisturbed by the modern world." Kyle stared at the genealogical charts, his name written at the bottom of a long line that included his parents, grandparents, and ancestors stretching back further than tribal memory. But there were other names, too, names he didn't recognize, with question marks beside them and the notation removed from population. "What does this mean?" He jabbed a finger at the unfamiliar names. Blackwood's smile was winter cold. "Sometimes we must make adjustments. Genetic diversity is crucial for a healthy, isolated population. When certain bloodlines become problematic, we intervene." "Curating," Blackwood corrected, "like tending a garden. We remove the weeds so the flowers can flourish." Kyle's hand moved instinctively to the bone knife at his belt, but Blackwood raised a warning finger. "I wouldn't. You're far too valuable to lose now. Third generation of the bloodline we've been cultivating. Your children will be special. I'll tell the elders. The whole tribe will know." Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "And who would believe you? A young man who violated sacred law by leaving the island? Besides, several of your elders are already aware of our arrangement." The words hit Kyle like a physical blow. He thought of Elder Makoa's strange reluctance to let him leave, the way certain tribal members sometimes disappeared during the season of storms, the foreign objects that occasionally washed up on their shores and were quickly hidden away by the council. "They know," he whispered. "Some do, others suspect. A few even help us identify the bloodlines that need pruning." Blackwood moved closer, and Kyle caught a scent like old bones and deep earth. "Your people's isolation isn't maintained by geography alone, boy. It requires constant vigilance." Kyle backed toward the door, his mind spinning with betrayal and horror. The photographs watched him go, faces of his people trapped behind glass like specimens in jars. "Where are you going?" Blackwood called after him. "There's so much more to show you." But Kyle was already running into the darkness, the stranger's laughter following him like smoke. The photographs seemed to pulse with malevolent life in the dim cabin light. Kyle's hands trembled as he lifted the lantern higher, casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with images of his people. His people, captured in moments they believed were private, sacred, unseen by any outside eyes. But these photographs were old, ancient even, the edges yellowed and cracked, the faces within them bearing the sepia tint of decades past. How could this be? His tribe had lived in perfect isolation for generations beyond counting. The elders spoke of the great protection, the barriers that kept the outside world from finding them, kept them safe from the corruption beyond their shores. Kyle's breath caught as he spotted a photograph that made his blood freeze. His father, unmistakably his father, but impossibly young, younger than Kyle himself was now. Standing beside a man Kyle had never seen before, a pale stranger with strange clothing and metal instruments hanging from his neck. They stood together like old friends, like conspirators sharing a secret joke. The photograph was dated. Kyle squinted at the faded numbers scratched into the corner 43 years ago, 2 years before Kyle was born, 2 years before his father had supposedly first laid eyes on his mother and decided to build their family within the safety of their sacred isolation. Kyle spun around, heart hammering, but found only shadows and dust motes dancing in the disturbed air. The cabin felt smaller now, pressing in around him like a closing fist. He needed to leave, needed to get back to the water, back to his boat, back to everything that made sense. But his feet wouldn't move. Instead, he found himself drawn deeper into the cabin, toward a desk that sat beneath the largest collection of photographs. The desk's surface was covered with papers, charts, and what looked like maps, maps of his island. Detailed, precise maps showing every cove, every sacred grove, every hidden path that his people believed was known only to them. The papers were covered in the stranger's language, but scattered among the foreign words were names he recognized. His grandfather's name, his grandmother's, The names of elders, of children, of people who had died when Kyle was young, all written in the same careful handwriting, accompanied by notes and observations. One document made his vision blur with shock. It was a family tree, meticulously drawn, showing the bloodlines of his tribe going back generations. But this tree had branches that didn't belong, connections that shouldn't exist, lines linking his people to others, to outsiders, to a world beyond their island that supposedly had never touched them. At the bottom of the tree, Kyle found his own name. But beneath it, in red ink that looked disturbingly fresh, was another name he didn't recognize. Subject 247. Final phase initiated. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe. Kyle's vision tunneled as he stared at those words, trying to make sense of what they could mean. Subject, final phase? What kind of observation was this? A new sound reached his ears then, the distant rumble of an engine. Not the simple putt-putt of a fishing boat, but something larger, more powerful, coming closer. Panic finally broke through his paralysis. Kyle grabbed several of the photographs and documents, stuffing them into his clothing. Whatever this place was, whoever had built this monument to his tribe's violated privacy, he needed proof. He needed evidence to take back to the elders, to show them that their sacred isolation was a lie. The engine sound grew louder. Through the grimy window, Kyle could see lights cutting through the darkness. Searchlights, sweeping back and forth across the water with mechanical precision. They were looking for something. They were looking for him. Kyle extinguished the lantern and crept toward the back of the cabin. There had to be another way out, a way that wouldn't expose him to whoever was approaching. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed a trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden beneath a moth-eaten rug. The voices reached him now, men calling to each other in that foreign tongue, their words sharp with urgency and authority. Boot steps on the dock, the slam of a door. They were already inside the building below. Kyle pulled open the trapdoor, revealing a ladder that descended into blackness. Without hesitation, he climbed down, pulling the door closed above him just as he heard heavy footsteps entering the cabin above. In the absolute darkness below, surrounded by the smell of earth and decay, Kyle pressed the stolen photographs against his chest and tried to understand how his entire world had just crumbled into lies. The journal's pages crackled like dried leaves as Kyle turned them, each entry revealing another layer of the impossible truth. Dr. Marcus Whitmore's handwriting grew more erratic as the dates progressed, his clinical observations dissolving into fevered rambling. Kyle's hands trembled. Subjects, protocols, the sacred words of his ancestors, the creation myths, the stories of their emergence from the great waters, suddenly felt hollow, manufactured. Day 1203, children born within the compound show no knowledge of the outside world. The memory suppression treatments administered to the first generation appear to be holding. They genuinely believe this island is their ancestral home. The photographs scattered around him seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. His grandfather as a young man, but not on their island, standing beside a concrete building with barred windows. His grandmother's sister, who the elders said had been taken by sea spirits, smiling nervously at the camera, while men in white coats stood behind her. A sound outside made him freeze. Footsteps on the cabin's wooden porch, deliberate and measured. Kyle quickly gathered the journal and several photographs, stuffing them into his woven bag. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, as if the visitor was examining the structure. Through a gap in the boarded windows, Kyle glimpsed a figure in modern clothing, khaki pants and a windbreaker that looked impossibly clean for someone who should have been traveling through the jungle. The man carried something that gleamed metallic in the filtered sunlight. Kyle pressed himself against the wall beside the door, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped directly outside. A voice called out, speaking in his tribal language but with an accent that made the familiar words sound clinical and strange. "We know you're in there. Come out slowly, and no harm will come to you." The language was perfect, too perfect. Every inflection, every tonal shift matched his own speech, but there was something fundamentally wrong about it. like a recording played back by someone who understood the sounds but not their soul. Your canoe was spotted yesterday. We've been waiting for one of you to finally make the crossing. Waiting. The word sent ice through Kyle's veins. They had been expecting this. He moved carefully toward the back of the cabin, where broken boards created a gap large enough to slip through. The journal pressed against his ribs, its revelations burning like a brand. As he squeezed through the opening, splinters caught his skin, but he barely noticed the pain. The jungle embraced him with familiar sounds. Birds calling, insects humming, leaves rustling in the humid air. But now even these comforting noises felt suspect. How much of what he thought he knew was real? Behind him, the cabin door opened with a prolonged creak. Footsteps entered the space he'd just vacated, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. "The photographs are gone," a voice said, no longer bothering with his tribal language. "And Journal 17. A radio crackled to life. "Copy that. Subject has been in the cache for approximately 4 hours. Assume full exposure to restricted materials. Understood. Initiating containment protocol." 7. Kyle ran deeper into the jungle, his bare feet finding purchase on roots and moss with instinctive precision. But the familiar terrain felt different now, as if a veil had been lifted to reveal the stage machinery behind an elaborate performance. Every tree, every path, every landmark carried the possibility of deception. The radio chatter faded behind him, but he knew they would follow. These people, whoever they were, had been watching his tribe for generations. They knew the island, probably better than he did. They would know where he might run, where he might hide. He needed to reach the canoe and return home, but doubt gnawed at him like a parasite. Home to what? To a people who might be nothing more than subjects in some vast experiment, to elders whose sacred knowledge might be implanted memories, to traditions that could be fabricated folklore designed to keep them compliant and isolated. The journal's pages rustled against his chest as he moved, each step carrying him further from the comfortable lies of his old life. He thought of his younger sister, who would be preparing for her initiation into the women's mysteries. Of his cousin, who spoke proudly of carrying on their ancestors' traditions. Of the children who listened wide-eyed to stories of their people's sacred origins. Were any of them real? Were any of their beliefs more than elaborate programming designed to keep them contained on their island prison? The sound of pursuit grew louder behind him, multiple voices now, coordinating their search with military precision. Kyle pushed harder through the undergrowth, driven by a desperate need to reach his canoe, to cross the waters that had once seemed like a protective barrier but now felt like the walls of a cage. The photographs in his bag rustled with each step, evidence of a truth too terrible to accept but too documented to deny. The photographs scattered across the cabin floor like fallen leaves, each one a violation of everything Kyle had been taught about his people's sacred isolation. His hands trembled as he gathered them, studying faces he recognized. His grandfather as a young man, his aunt before the ritual scars marked her as an elder, children who had grown old and died without ever knowing they had been watched. But it was the final photograph that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. His father, Noam, stood beside a white man in khaki clothing. Both were smiling. His father's arm rested casually on the stranger's shoulder, and in the background, Kyle could see the sacred grove, where only the most trusted elders were permitted to walk. The date stamped in the corner read 1987, the year before Kyle was born. The journal's leather binding cracked as he opened it with shaking fingers. The handwriting was precise, clinical. Day 847, subject continues to provide detailed information about tribal customs and territorial boundaries. The isolation protocol has been more successful than anticipated. N shows no signs of questioning the narrative we've constructed about outside contamination. Kyle's vision blurred. Subject. They called his father a subject. Day 923. Pregnancy confirmed among tribal population. If genetic markers prove viable, we may have found our control group. N assures us the child will be raised according to traditional isolation protocols. The journal slipped from his numb fingers. Control group. They were talking about him, about his birth, his life, his entire existence, as if it were an experiment. Thunder rumbled overhead as rain began pelting the cabin's tin roof. Kyle forced himself to keep reading, each page revealing deeper layers of betrayal. Maps of the island drawn in his father's hand, lists of tribal members with notations about their roles, their secrets, their fears. Reports on fishing patterns, seasonal migrations, sacred rituals that outsiders should never have witnessed. Day 1205. N reports successful implementation of the Forbidden Zone narrative. Tribal members now actively avoid the southern beaches where observation posts are located. Photography continues undetected. Kyle's throat constricted. The southern beaches had been declared cursed by the elders when he was barely walking. His people believed evil spirits dwelled there, that to set foot on that sand would bring sickness and death. But it wasn't spirits, it was cameras. It was men with lenses and notebooks, cataloguing their lives like specimens in a laboratory. Another photograph caught his eye, this one more recent. It showed the night of his manhood ceremony, the sacred ritual where boys became warriors. He remembered that night clearly. The pain of the scarification, the pride in his father's eyes, the sense of belonging to something ancient and pure. But here it was, captured by some hidden observer, reduced to documentary evidence. He found his own face in dozens of images spanning his entire life. First steps, first hunt, first kill, moments of joy and sorrow and discovery, all watched and recorded by strangers who treated his existence like a nature documentary. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows as Kyle turned to the journal's final entries. Dr. Marcus Henley's handwriting had grown increasingly erratic. Day 2847. The funding committee grows impatient. They want results beyond simple behavioral observation. N has agreed to assist with the next phase, though he seems troubled by the implications, reminded him of his obligations to the project. Day 2903, equipment arrived via supply drop. N refuses to cooperate further, threatened to expose the operation to his people, reminded him what would happen to his son if he betrays us now. Kyle's blood roared in his ears. They had threatened him, used him as leverage against his own father. Day 2910. Problem resolved. N suffered fatal accident during hunting expedition. Officially ruled as encounter with wild boar, though sedation drugs made the process considerably easier. Cover story already disseminated among tribal leadership. Project can continue as planned. The journal fell from Kyle's hands as the truth crashed over him like a tsunami. His father hadn't died in a hunting accident. He'd been murdered, killed because he'd tried to protect his people, protect his son from whatever these outsiders had planned. Lightning illuminated the cabin as Kyle sank to his knees among the scattered photographs. Everything was a lie. Their isolation, their purity, their sacred separation from the contaminated world. It was all an elaborate cage designed to keep them contained while hidden observers studied their every move. But why? What did these people want? What was the next phase his father had died trying to prevent? Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but Kyle barely noticed. He was already drowning in revelations that shattered his understanding of reality itself. His father's face stared up at him from dozens of photographs, sometimes smiling alongside his captors, sometimes troubled and withdrawn, as the weight of his secret collaboration grew unbearable. Kyle gathered the photographs with newfound determination. His father had tried to protect their people and paid with his life. Now it fell to him to finish what Noam had started, to uncover the full scope of this violation and find a way to stop it, even if it meant leaving behind everything he'd ever believed to be true. The photographs scattered across the cabin floor like fallen leaves, each one a violation of everything Kyle had been taught about his people's sacred isolation. His hands trembled as he gathered them, studying faces he recognized. His grandfather as a young man, His great-aunt, before the ritual scarring, marked her as an elder, children who had grown old and died decades ago. But it was the final photograph that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. His own face stared back at him, captured in perfect detail, not as he was now, standing in this cursed cabin, but as he had been 3 days ago on the beach of his island home, preparing the outrigger canoe for his journey. The angle suggested the photographer had been positioned on the reef, using a powerful lens to capture the image from across the lagoon. Someone had been watching. Someone had been documenting his people for generations, and they had known he would come here. Kyle's breathing became shallow as he examined the photograph more closely. In the background, barely visible, stood his sister Naya by the sacred fire pit. She had warned him not to leave, had spoken of dreams filled with shadow and blood. The shamans had declared his journey forbidden, but Kyle had dismissed their fears as superstition. Now, holding proof that outsiders had been observing his tribe for decades, those warnings took on a terrifying new significance. A floorboard creaked behind him. Kyle spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the cabin remained empty. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through the grimy windows. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. The sound could have been the old woods settling, or small animals moving beneath the structure. But the feeling of being watched pressed against him like a physical weight. He moved to the window overlooking the path he had taken to reach this place. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of towering pines and tangled undergrowth. Somewhere in that green labyrinth, someone might be observing him even now, adding another photograph to their collection. The thought sent him scrambling toward the cabin's rear wall, where he had noticed something earlier, a section of wood paneling that didn't quite align with the rest. His fingers found the edges and pulled. The panel swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow space behind the wall. Inside, manila folders hung from metal rails like specimens in some grotesque filing system. Each folder bore a label written in a precise, clinical hand: Tribal Structure 1960, 2 to 1975. Burial rituals, sacred sites, bloodline documentation. Kyle pulled down the folder marked Bloodline Documentation with shaking fingers. Inside were genealogical charts mapping his people's family trees going back 6 generations. Every birth, every death, every marriage ceremony had been meticulously recorded. Penciled notes filled the margins, subject exhibits enhanced night vision, genetic trait, and unusual healing rate observed in this bloodline. They had been studying his people like laboratory animals. The folder slipped from his numb fingers, scattering papers across the floor. Among them was a medical report dated just 2 years ago, documenting tissue samples taken from unknowing subjects during routine interactions. The clinical language made Kyle's stomach churn. DNA analysis confirms unique genetic markers not found in surrounding populations. A memory surfaced. His cousin Jorik had fallen ill 3 summers ago after eating what he claimed was a strange fruit he had never seen before. The shamans had treated it as a test from the spirits, but Jorik had mentioned finding the fruit in an unusual place, near the forbidden northern shore, where tribal law prohibited anyone from venturing. What if it hadn't been a fruit at all? What if it had been bait, designed to make Jorik sick enough to require help from these researchers posing as concerned strangers? Kyle grabbed another folder, Project Sentinel, Phase 3. Inside, he found blueprints for what appeared to be a research facility, along with construction schedules and supply lists. The proposed location made his knees weak, a small island less than 10 miles from his tribe's home, hidden behind a cluster of uninhabited atolls. They were planning something bigger: the photographs, the tissue samples, the genetic analysis. It had all been preparation for this next phase. At the bottom of the folder lay a single sheet of paper marked Priority Targets for Acquisition. The list contained 12 names written in that same precise handwriting. Kyle's name topped the list, followed by his sister Naya, their cousin Jorik, and 9 other members of their tribe. The word acquisition sent ice through his veins. Below the names, someone had written a date in red ink, tomorrow. Outside, branches snapped under heavy footsteps, and Kyle realized with crystalline clarity that he had walked directly into a trap that had been decades in the making. The journal's pages crackled like dried leaves as Kyle turned them with trembling fingers. Each entry pulled him deeper into a nightmare he couldn't have imagined. The handwriting grew more erratic as the dates progressed. The ink sometimes smeared as if written in haste or desperation. Day 47. The ritual worked better than expected. The children especially respond to the frequency modulations. Their neural pathways are remarkably adaptable. Dr. Voss believes we can achieve complete behavioral modification within the lunar cycle. Kyle's breath caught. The lunar cycle, their most sacred time when the tribe gathered for the ceremony of echoes. He'd participated in it since childhood, feeling the strange tingling in his mind that the elders said was communion with the ancestors. But this suggested something else entirely. Day 52, minor setback. 3 subjects developed resistance to the base frequency, had to increase amplitude. 1 subject experienced severe cranial bleeding. Voss insists this is within acceptable parameters for breakthrough research. The words blurred as Kyle's hands shook. He forced himself to continue reading, though every instinct screamed at him to run back to the boats, to return to the island and pretend he'd never found this place. Day 61. Remarkable discovery. The tribal shaman appears to have natural resistance but not immunity. When we modified the harmonic sequence to match their traditional chants, we achieved unprecedented results. The entire population now responds to our signals. They perform rituals exactly as programmed, believe memories we've implanted, even accept the presence of our hidden observation posts as sacred stones. Sacred stones. Kyle's mind reeled back to the towering rocks that dotted their island, ancient monoliths that his people had revered for generations. The stones that hummed softly during certain weather patterns that made his teeth ache if he stood too close during the full moon. Day 78. The children born after implementation show the most promising results. Complete integration of artificial memories with natural development. They will never question the narrative we've constructed. Dr. Voss has named them Generation Zero, the first truly programmed human population. Generation Zero. Kyle calculated quickly. He would have been born just after that time frame. His earliest memories, his deepest beliefs about their origins, their isolation, their sacred duty to remain hidden from the outside world. Had any of it been real? A loose photograph fell from between the pages. Kyle picked it up and immediately wished he hadn't. It showed a young woman he recognized as his grandmother, but decades younger than he'd ever known her. She was strapped to a metal table, electrodes attached to her skull, her eyes wide with terror. In the background, men in white coats observed clipboards and machinery that looked alien and wrong. The journal entry beside the photo was brief but chilling. At subject 23, tribal designation, Amara the Songkeeper shows exceptional resistance. Recommend immediate termination and replacement with programmed substitute. But his grandmother had lived for decades after this photo was taken. She'd taught him the old songs, the history of their people, the importance of their isolation, which meant, the woman who raised me wasn't my grandmother at all. The words escaped his lips as a whisper, but in the cabin's silence they sounded like a scream. He flipped frantically through more pages, desperate to find something that would prove his growing suspicions wrong. Day 95. Population replacement progressing smoothly. Original subjects who showed resistance have been eliminated and replaced with trained actors from our program. The remaining tribal members accept the substitutes without question. The programming ensures they perceive familiar faces and mannerisms even where none exist. Day 112, Dr. Voss's grand experiment reaches completion. We now have a completely controlled human population living in what they believe is natural isolation. Every tradition, every belief, every story they tell their children has been carefully crafted by our team. They are living proof that human consciousness can be entirely manufactured. Kyle's vision tunneled. The people he'd grown up with, the elders who'd taught him their ways, the sacred traditions passed down through generations. How much of it had been real? How many of the faces he'd known and loved had belonged to strangers, actors trained to play roles in some twisted experiment? But worse than the deception was the growing realization of what it meant for him. If the entire population had been controlled, programmed, monitored, then his presence here couldn't be an accident. His sudden compulsion to venture beyond the island for the first time in his life, his unerring navigation to this specific cabin, none of it felt like his own choice anymore. The final entry in the journal was dated just 3 days ago. Designation, neural triggers implanted during childhood ceremonies have guided him to the revelation site as planned. Phase 2 of the experiment can now begin. Dr. Voss awaits his arrival at the mainland facility. After 30 years of controlling an isolated population, we're ready to test our methods on the wider world. The journal slipped from Kyle's nerveless fingers. In the growing darkness of the cabin, he finally understood the truth. He hadn't discovered this place by accident. He'd been programmed to find it. Kavi's hands trembled as he lifted another photograph from the metal box, this one showing his grandmother as a young woman, her face painted with the sacred white clay reserved only for the fertility ceremonies. She stood beside a man he didn't recognize, tall, pale-skinned, wearing strange clothes that covered his entire body despite the tropical heat. The stranger's arm rested casually on her shoulder, as if they were old friends. The dates scrawled on the back made his stomach lurch. 1952. 23 years before his own birth, when the tribe's isolation was supposed to be absolute. He set the photograph aside with shaking fingers and reached for the leather journal beneath it. The cover was worn smooth, darkened by decades of handling. Inside, pages upon pages of handwritten notes filled every available space, accompanied by detailed sketches of tribal customs, maps of the island's interior, and what appeared to be a genealogical chart spanning 4 generations of his people. Subject exhibits remarkable linguistic capabilities, read one entry dated June 15, 1951. Unlike previous specimens, she demonstrates complex reasoning and abstract thought patterns that challenge our fundamental assumptions about cognitive development in isolated populations. Kavi's blood ran cold. Specimens. They were writing about his people like laboratory animals. He flipped through more pages, his horror mounting with each revelation. Detailed medical observations filled the margins. Blood types, genetic markers, neurological responses to various stimuli. Charts tracked breeding patterns across family lines, noting which combinations produced offspring with desirable traits and which resulted in what the writers coldly termed developmental anomalies. A loose photograph slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Kavi picked it up and immediately wished he hadn't. It showed the interior of what looked like a medical facility. Sterile white walls, metal tables, strange machines with wires and tubes. But it was the figure strapped to the central table that made him drop the image as if it had burned him. His grandfather, unmistakably, though decades younger than Kavi had ever known him. Unconscious, with electrodes attached to his temples and chest, while men in white coats stood around him making notations on clipboards. The journal entry for that date was brief but devastating. Memory suppression protocol successful. Subject shows no recollection of laboratory procedures upon return to native environment. Recommend expanding program to include broader population sampling. Kavi sank back against the cabin wall, his mind reeling. Everything he had believed about his tribe's history, their sacred isolation, their pure bloodline untouched by the outside world, all of it was a lie. They hadn't been hidden from civilization. They had been subjects in some vast, multi-generational experiment. He forced himself to keep reading. though each page brought fresh horrors. References to genetic enhancement protocols and behavioral modification studies filled the margins. Charts tracked the introduction of specific genetic markers into the tribal population through what the scientists euphemistically called guided breeding programs. One entry, dated 1974, made his blood freeze. Subject 47A has successfully conceived. Genetic modifications appear stable. Child will represent culmination of 23 years of selective enhancement. Recommend continued monitoring through maturity. The date was just 1 year before his birth. Subject 47A could only be his mother. Beside his name in red ink, someone had written, "Primary subject. All previous work leads to this bloodline. Proceed to phase 3 upon subject's 25th birthday." His 25th birthday was in 3 days. A sound outside the cabin made him freeze, the snap of a twig, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps on fallen leaves. Kavi quickly stuffed the photographs and journal back into the metal box, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had assumed the cabin was abandoned, but what if its occupants were simply away? What if they had returned? A shadow passed across the glass, too tall and angular to be anyone from his tribe, then another and another. Multiple figures moved through the darkness beyond the thin walls, their movements coordinated and purposeful. One of them spoke in a language Kavi didn't recognize, though the tone was unmistakably authoritative. Another voice responded, and he caught a fragment that chilled him to the bone. 25 years of preparation. Subject is finally ready. They were talking about him. They had been waiting for him to come here, waiting for him to discover the truth. But why? What did they want with him that required a quarter-century of planning? The door handle began to turn. But it was the date scrawled on the back that made Kyle's blood run cold, 37 years ago. 2 years before Kyle's own birth, when the tribe's isolation was supposed to be absolute. He set the photograph aside and reached for another from the scattered pile. This one showed his Aunt Mira as a young woman, her belly swollen with pregnancy, the same pale stranger's hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Kyle had been told his cousin Tam's father died in a fishing accident before birth, but the man in these photos looked very much alive. The cabin door creaked behind him. Kyle spun around, expecting to see the bearded man returning, but found only shifting shadows cast by the oil lamp's flickering flame. His nerves were fraying like old rope, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. He turned back to the photographs, driven by a compulsion he couldn't name. The next image showed the pale stranger participating in the ritual of the sacred fire, wearing the ceremonial paint that should only touch the skin of those born to the tribe. Kyle's grandfather stood beside him, not as captor or curious host, but as an equal, as a brother. A sick realization began to form in Kyle's mind. He rifled through more photographs, finding image after image of integration, of acceptance, of deception. The stranger wasn't a visitor or an intruder. He had lived among them, walked their paths, shared their fires, fathered their children. And then Kyle found the photograph that destroyed everything he thought he knew about himself. His mother, barely 18, sat beside the pale stranger on the beach where Kyle had played as a child. Her hand rested in his, their fingers intertwined with the casual intimacy of lovers. Her other hand curved over her pregnant belly, and she gazed up at the man with an expression of pure adoration that Kyle had never seen on her face when she looked at the man he'd called father. The world tilted around him. Kyle stumbled backward, knocking over the oil lamp. It clattered to the floor but didn't break, casting wild shadows across the cabin walls as it rolled. He grabbed it with shaking hands, holding it up to study the photograph again, hoping desperately that the shifting light had deceived him. The door slammed open, and the bearded man filled the doorway. His eyes immediately found the photograph in Kyle's hand, and his expression shifted from annoyance to something approaching pity. "You weren't supposed to find those yet," the man said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I wanted to prepare you first." "Who is he?" Kyle's voice came out as barely a whisper. His name was David, Dr. David Merrick. He was an anthropologist sent by the university to study isolated populations in the Pacific. But he found more than he bargained for when he reached your island. How did he? The island is protected. The reefs, the currents. He was very resourceful and very determined. The bearded man moved closer, his movements careful and non-threatening. He lived among your people for almost 3 years, learned your language, your customs, your beliefs. He became one of you in every way that mattered. Kyle's legs gave out, and he sank to the floor, still clutching the photograph. My father, the man who raised you, is a good man. He knew the truth, but he loved your mother enough to claim you as his own. The tribe decided it was better that way, simpler. Were already broken long before David arrived. The bearded man's voice grew heavy with old secrets. Your people aren't as isolated as you believe, Kale. They never have been. The story of sacred separation is just that, a story. A beautiful lie told to keep the young from wandering, to maintain the illusion of purity. Kyle looked up at him, seeing his own features reflected in the stranger's face. The same eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same hands that now trembled as they held the evidence of everything he'd lost. You're him, Kyle breathed. You're David. The man who had been living a lie for over 30 years knelt down beside his son. Hello, Kyle. I've been waiting a very long time to meet you. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, each sound echoing in the confined space. He counted 23 steps before reaching the bottom, where his bare feet touched cold concrete. The air was thick here, pressing against his skin like invisible hands. He fumbled along the wall until his fingers found a switch. Fluorescent lights flickered to life, revealing a laboratory that made the cabin above seem quaint. Stainless steel tables stretched across the room, their surfaces stained with substances that had long since dried to rust-colored smears. Glass containers lined metal shelving units, filled with specimens floating in yellowed preservative. But it was the far wall that drew his attention and held it with magnetic horror. More photographs, but these were different. Clinical, scientific. His people laid out on examination tables, their bodies opened and explored like curious puzzles. Men, women, children, all bearing the distinctive bone ornaments and ritual scarification of his tribe. In some images, they appeared to be sleeping. In others, their eyes stared with the glassy fixation of death. Kyle's knees buckled. He gripped the nearest table for support, his fingers slipping on its cold surface. These weren't just surveillance photographs. They were documentation of something far worse. Systematic study, experimentation, dissection of his people over what appeared to be decades. Subject exhibits heightened resistance to malaria strains introduced to general population. Liver function remains optimal, despite exposure levels that proved fatal to control subjects. Recommend continued study of genetic markers. The words blurred as understanding crashed over him. His people weren't just being watched, they were being harvested, studied, used as subjects in experiments that spanned generations. He pulled another folder. 1994. This one contained photographs of children he recognized, not personally, but their faces held the familiar features of his extended family. The reports detailed their responses to various diseases, their recovery rates, their genetic anomalies. Several files were marked with red stamps, deceased, specimen retained. A sound from above froze him in place. Footsteps on the cabin floor, heavy boots, moving with purpose. Kyle's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized he was trapped. The basement had only one exit, and whoever was upstairs now stood between him and escape. The footsteps moved systematically through the cabin, pausing in what sounded like the main room where the photographs hung. Then they approached the basement door. Kyle looked frantically around the laboratory, seeking another way out, but found only solid concrete walls lined with the tools of clinical horror. "I know you're down there," a voice called from the top of the stairs. It was calm, educated, with an accent Kyle couldn't place. "You might as well come up." There's nowhere else to go. Kyle pressed himself against the far wall, next to the filing cabinet. His mind raced through his options. He could try to fight his way past whoever waited above, but he had no weapons, no knowledge of combat beyond the ceremonial dances of his people. He could hide and hope they went away, but the basement offered few concealment options. "Your presence here is quite remarkable, actually," the voice continued, and Kyle heard the creak of the first step. "We've been monitoring your people for so long, but we never expected one of you to venture this far from the island. It presents a unique opportunity for study." The footsteps descended slowly, deliberately. Kyle could see polished black shoes, then the cuffs of dark trousers. A man in his 60s appeared, wearing a white coat over street clothes. His hair was silver, neatly combed, and his eyes held the cold fascination of someone examining an interesting specimen. "Dr. Marcus Webb," the man introduced himself, as if they were meeting at a social gathering. "I've dedicated my career to studying your remarkable people, your genetic resistance to disease, your longevity, your unique physiological adaptations. Absolutely fascinating." He reached the bottom of the stairs and smiled with what might have been genuine warmth, if not for the calculated hunger in his gaze. "And now, here you are, a perfect test subject who's come to me voluntarily. We're going to learn so much together." Kyle found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "My people. What did you do to them?" Dr. Webb's smile widened. "We helped them reach their full potential. And now, my boy, it's your turn." The metal door groaned as Kyle pulled it open, revealing a staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The air that wafted up carried the scent of old wood and something else, something organic and unsettling that made his stomach clench. Behind him, the photographs seemed to watch from their frames, silent witnesses to whatever lay below. His flashlight beam danced across concrete walls as he descended, each step echoing in the confined space. The temperature dropped noticeably, and condensation beaded on the walls like sweat. Halfway down, he noticed scratches in the concrete, deep gouges that looked disturbingly like claw marks, though far too large for any animal he knew. The basement opened into a laboratory that belonged in his worst nightmares. Stainless steel tables dominated the center of the room, their surfaces stained with rust-colored patches that Kyle desperately hoped weren't what they appeared to be. Glass cabinets lined the walls, filled with specimens floating in yellowed fluid. His light caught glimpses of tissue samples, organs, and things he couldn't identify suspended in their preservative baths. But it was the corner of the room that made his blood freeze. A massive refrigeration unit hummed quietly, its door slightly ajar. Kyle approached it with the reluctance of a man walking to his own execution. The metal handle was cold against his palm as he pulled the door open. Inside, arranged on metal shelves like specimens in a museum, were dozens of vials containing blood samples. Each vial bore a label with a number and a date stretching back over 40 years. But worse than the blood were the other containers, larger jars holding what appeared to be human tissue, organs, and in one horrifying case, what looked like a severed hand, marked with the distinctive blue-black tattoos of his tribe's warriors. Kyle stumbled backward, his flashlight beam wavering as his hands shook. The implications crashed over him like a tide of poison. Someone had been harvesting pieces of his people for decades. The isolation his tribe had maintained so carefully, the sacred barriers they believed protected them, it had all been an illusion. A filing cabinet stood against the far wall, and with trembling fingers, Kyle pulled open the drawers. Inside were medical records, detailed notes written in multiple languages, and photographs that made the ones upstairs seem benign by comparison. These showed surgical procedures, dissections, experiments performed on bodies he recognized, faces from the oldest photographs upstairs, tribe members who had supposedly died of natural causes or accidents over the years. One folder was thicker than the others, labeled simply Project Genesis. Inside, Kyle found documents that made his vision blur with horror and rage. The papers detailed a systematic study of his people's genetics, their unusual longevity, their resistance to certain diseases. But the most damning document was a shipping manifest dated just 3 months ago, listing biological samples sent to laboratories in Geneva, Tokyo, and Atlanta. His people weren't just being studied, they were being harvested like crops. A sound from upstairs made him freeze. Footsteps crossed the cabin floor above, slow and deliberate. Someone had arrived, and they were moving through the rooms with the confidence of familiarity. Kyle clicked off his flashlight and stood in absolute darkness, listening to the footsteps pause directly over his head. The basement door opened, spilling artificial light down the stairs. "I know you're down there," a voice called out, calm, professional, with an accent Kyle couldn't place. "There's no other way out, so we might as well have a civilized conversation." Kyle pressed himself against the wall behind the refrigeration unit, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain it would give him away. The footsteps began descending the stairs, unhurried but purposeful. "You must be young Kyle," the voice continued conversationally. "Son of Naya the healer, grandson of old Turkara. Yes, we know all about you. We've been watching your family line for 3 generations now. Remarkable genetic markers, truly exceptional resistance to cellular aging." The man reached the bottom of the stairs, and Kyle caught a glimpse of him in the reflected light. Middle-aged, wearing a clean white coat over practical clothes, carrying what looked like a medical bag. He moved through the laboratory with practiced ease, checking his specimens like a gardener tending plants. "Your grandmother was particularly interesting," the man said, pulling on latex gloves. "Her telomeres showed virtually no degradation, even at age 90. And your mother, well, her blood work revealed proteins we'd never seen before. Revolutionary discoveries, really." Kyle's rage built like pressure in a sealed container. This monster spoke of his family like they were lab rats, their sacred lives reduced to data points in his twisted research. "But you, Kyle," the man continued, now standing directly in front of the refrigeration unit, "you represent something special. The first of your people to leave the island voluntarily. That changes the legal implications considerably. No more need for indirect sampling methods." The man's shadow fell across Kyle's hiding spot as he reached for the refrigerator door. His hand trembled as he turned the handle. The door swung open silently, and Kyle stepped into a corridor lined with fluorescent lights that flickered to life automatically, triggered by his movement. The sudden brightness made him squint, and for a moment he stood frozen, overwhelmed by what lay before him. The underground facility stretched out in both directions, its walls lined with glass-fronted rooms. Inside each room, Kyle could see equipment, cameras with lenses longer than his arm, computer monitors displaying satellite images, and walls covered with maps. But it was the photographs that stopped his breath entirely. Every surface was covered with images of his people, not just the handful he'd found in the cabin above, but thousands upon thousands of photographs spanning what appeared to be decades. Pictures of tribal ceremonies he remembered from his childhood, images of his own father as a young man, standing beside the sacred fire, his grandmother weaving baskets by the shore, children playing games in the village center, children who were now adults, their faces captured in innocent moments they never knew were being watched. Kyle moved deeper into the facility, his bare feet silent on the polished floor. In the first room, he found detailed genealogical charts mapping his tribe's bloodlines going back generations. Names he recognized, relationships documented with clinical precision, birth dates, death dates, notes about physical characteristics and behavioral patterns written in a cramped, methodical hand. The second room contained what appeared to be medical equipment, alongside more photographs. These ones different, more invasive. Pictures taken with telephoto lenses of tribal members swimming, bathing, engaged in private moments they believed were unobserved. Red circles had been drawn around certain individuals with numbers and codes written in the margins. A large monitor dominated the far wall, and as Kyle approached, it flickered to life. The screen showed a live satellite feed of his island, the image so clear he could make out individual huts in his village. A timestamp in the corner showed the current date and time. They were watching even now. Subject displays, Advanced healing knowledge inconsistent with expected technological level, one entry read. Recommend increased observation of shaman activities. Plant samples needed for analysis. Another entry dated 5 years ago, population holding steady at 847 individuals. Genetic diversity remains high despite isolation. Continue monitoring for signs of outside contact. Kyle's hands shook as he flipped through page after page of his people's lives, reduced to clinical observations. Every sacred ritual documented and analyzed. Every birth and death recorded, their entire existence catalogued like specimens in a laboratory. The final room contained something that made Keel's blood freeze. Weapons, tranquilizer guns, nets, restraints, plans drawn up for what was labeled collection protocol, maps showing optimal landing points on the island, schedules for tides and weather patterns. Lists of priority subjects for capture, with his own name circled at the top. Beside the weapons lay a thick folder marked Phase 2 implementation. Inside, Keel found blueprints for a research facility to be built on his island, complete with holding cells and medical laboratories. A timeline showed construction beginning in 3 months. The final page was a memo discussing population management and breeding program optimization. The folder slipped from Kyle's numb fingers, its contents scattering across the floor. The photographs, the surveillance, the years of watching, it had all been preparation for this. His people weren't just being observed, they were being studied like animals, catalogued and prepared for harvest. A soft chime echoed through the facility, and Kyle looked up to see a red light blinking on one of the monitors. Motion sensors, he realized with growing horror. His presence had triggered an alert. Somewhere above, he heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching, engines growing louder by the second. Multiple vehicles, moving fast. Kyle grabbed as many of the documents as he could carry, stuffing them into his shirt. The photographs of his family, the genealogical charts, the implementation plans, evidence of what was coming for his people. He had to warn them, had to get back to the island before Phase 2 began. But first, he had to escape this place alive. The facility's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Kyle sprinted through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. Behind him, he could hear the screech of metal doors sealing and the mechanical voice announcing containment protocols. His bare feet slapped against cold linoleum, the stolen keycard clutched in his sweating palm. He had to reach the surface, had to warn his people. But first, he needed to find a way to destroy this place. The corridor branched ahead, and Kyle chose left, following signs that pointed toward emergency exit, level 2. The air grew thicker, tinged with the acrid smell of burning electronics. Whatever Dr. Voss had triggered, the facility was slowly consuming itself. A door marked communications caught his eye. Kyle swiped the keycard, praying it still worked. The lock disengaged with a soft click, and he slipped inside. Banks of monitors lined the walls, most now dark or displaying error messages. But 3 screens still functioned, showing grainy surveillance footage from around the island. Kyle's breath caught. On one monitor, he could see boats approaching the northern shore, sleek military vessels cutting through the dawn light. On another, figures in hazmat suits were setting up equipment on the beach where he'd first landed. They were already here. "No," he whispered, pressing his hands against the screen. "No, no, no." A sound behind him made him spin around. Dr. Voss stood in the doorway, her once pristine coat torn and stained with blood. She looked older somehow, her face gaunt with exhaustion and something else. Regret. "You're too late," she said quietly. "It began the moment you left the island. We've been tracking you since you were 12 years old, Kale. Every ritual, every ceremony. We know your people better than you do." "The tracking device," he said, understanding flooding through him. "In the vaccine?" She nodded, among other things. "Did you really think your isolation was natural? That the storms that kept ships away were just weather?" We've been managing your environment for decades, keeping you contained until we were ready. Ready for what? But even as he asked, he knew. Harvest, she said simply. Your people's unique genetic markers, their resistance to certain diseases, their longevity, all of it carefully cultivated through generations of selective pressures. You were never a lost tribe, Kyle. You were a crop. The monitors flickered, and new images appeared. Laboratory rooms filled with glass chambers, each containing what looked like pale, floating forms. Human forms. The camera zoomed in on one, and Kyle saw a face he recognized. His cousin Naya, who had died of fever 3 years ago. Except she wasn't dead. None of them were dead. The bodies we returned to you for burial, Dr. Voss continued, watching his horrified expression. Clever synthetic duplicates. Your people's deaths simply marked their graduation to a new phase of the program. Kyle's legs gave out and he collapsed into a chair. Everything he'd believed, everything he'd fought for, was a lie. There had never been any isolation, there had never been any protection. They were livestock, and he was the last free-range specimen. Why tell me this? He managed. Because it's over. The program is being terminated. Your people's genetic material has been successfully synthesized. The living subjects are no longer needed, and frankly, the facility has become too expensive to maintain. She gestured at the monitors showing the military operation. Clean-up crews. By tomorrow there will be no trace that any of this ever existed. Your island will be just another uninhabited speck in the ocean. Kyle looked at the screens again, watching soldiers methodically work through the caves. But something was wrong with the image. The quality was too poor, the angles too convenient. And there, in the corner of one frame, he caught a glimpse of something that made him look closer. These are old recordings, he said suddenly. Dr. Voss's composure slipped for just a moment. What? The stone formation in the eastern cave, it collapsed in the earthquake 2 months ago. But it's intact in this footage. He stood, new hope surging through him. This is archival footage. You're showing me old security recordings. A silence confirmed his suspicion. They don't know, do they? He pressed. Your cleanup crews. They went to the island expecting to find my people in the caves, but the caves are empty. My people aren't there anymore. Dr. Voss's expression hardened. It doesn't matter. We'll find them. But Kyle was already moving, his mind racing. If his people had abandoned the caves, they'd have gone to the secondary shelter, the hidden caverns his grandfather had shown him as a child, caverns that appeared on no maps, in no photographs. He still had time. The journal's final pages crackled like autumn leaves. As Kyle turned them with trembling fingers, Sarah's flashlight beam wavered, casting dancing shadows across the cramped cabin walls lined with decades of surveillance photographs. The weight of revelation pressed down on him like the ocean depths he'd once feared would swallow him whole. Day 2847. The mutation accelerates. Subject 23 developed the characteristic cranial ridges overnight. The enzyme we've been introducing through the water supply shows remarkable results. Dr. Morrison believes we'll have a sustainable population of enhanced subjects within 2 generations. Your grandfather, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling the cabin's windows. Look at the date. The entry was written 3 days after Kyle's grandfather had been born. He flipped backward through brittle pages, finding earlier references to the same subject number. The scientists had been tracking bloodlines, monitoring genetic changes across generations like farmers tending crops. Subject 23 shows exceptional intelligence markers alongside physical enhancements. The cranial modifications appear to correlate with expanded cognitive capacity. Dr. Morrison suggests this one may be suitable for eventual contact protocols. Contact protocols. Kyle's hands shook as he absorbed the clinical language describing his grandfather's childhood, his development, his selection. Everything his people believed about their sacred isolation, their divine protection from the outside world, all carefully orchestrated lies. Thunder exploded overhead, and through the cabin's single window, Kyle glimpsed movement in the tree line. Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip tight enough to bruise. "We're not alone." Figures emerged from the storm-lashed darkness, moving with inhuman precision through the driving rain. Their silhouettes seemed wrong somehow, proportions subtly distorted. As lightning illuminated their faces, Kyle saw the truth that made his blood turn to ice water. "The failed experiments," Sarah breathed, reading from another journal entry. Morrison's notes mentioned subjects who couldn't integrate into normal tribal structure. They were relocated to mainland observation posts. The creatures, Kyle could no longer think of them as people, pressed against the cabin's walls. Their movements created a rhythmic scraping sound that set his teeth on edge. Through the gaps in the weathered boards, he caught glimpses of pale flesh marked with surgical scars, of modifications that had gone beyond simple enhancement into grotesque experimentation. "Listen to this," Sarah's voice cracked with urgency. The final entry. Phase 3 authorization received. Enhanced subjects show remarkable adaptability to environmental toxins. Military applications unlimited. Dr. Morrison proceeding with full population integration. The tribe will serve as our perfect isolated laboratory for biological warfare development. The words hit Kyle like physical blows, not just genetic enhancement, weaponization. His people hadn't been chosen by gods or protected by spirits. They'd been deliberately transformed into living weapons, isolated on their island not for their safety, but to contain them until they were needed. The scraping stopped. In the sudden silence, Kyle heard something far worse, whispering. The failed experiments were communicating in a bastardized version of his tribal language, words corrupted by whatever had been done to their minds. "They want us to come outside," he translated, his voice hollow. "They're saying the storm isn't safe, that shelter awaits those who surrender." Sarah's flashlight flickered, battery dying. In the growing darkness, Kyle felt the weight of his grandfather's deception pressing down like a physical force. The old man had known, had been part of it. Every story about divine favor, every ritual involving the sacred pools, every lesson about their people's special destiny, carefully crafted lies to maintain compliance with an experiment spanning generations. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Through the loose board, Kyle saw pale hands reaching through gaps in the walls. The creature's patience was ending. "There has to be another way out," Sarah said, but her voice carried no conviction. The cabin was a trap, positioned perfectly to funnel escapees into predetermined routes. Everything had been planned, calculated, orchestrated by minds that viewed human beings as laboratory materials. As the walls began to buckle under coordinated pressure, Kyle realized they faced something far worse than death. Outside waited the fate his people had unknowingly accepted decades ago, transformation into weapons in a war they didn't even know was being fought. The first board splintered, and hungry hands reached through the darkness toward them. The laboratory stretched deeper into the mountainside than Kyle had imagined possible, a sprawling complex of sterile corridors and observation rooms carved from living rock. Dr. Sarah Chen moved ahead of him with practiced familiarity, her keycard granting access to increasingly restricted areas. Each door they passed bore warnings in multiple languages, biohazard symbols, and clearance levels that seemed to climb toward something monumentally classified. "Your people weren't the first," Chen said as they walked, her voice echoing off polished concrete walls. "The Foundation has been studying isolated populations for over a century, but your tribe, you were always different, special." Kyle's bare feet made no sound on the cold floor, his every sense heightened by the antiseptic smell and artificial lighting. Through reinforced windows, he glimpsed laboratories filled with equipment he couldn't begin to understand, machines that hummed and blinked with alien purpose. "The photographs in the cabin," he said. "How long have you been watching us?" Chen paused at a heavy steel door marked with radiation warnings. "Watching isn't the right word. Protecting, preserving. Your grandfather understood that when he made the original agreement." The door hissed open, revealing an elevator that descended far deeper than the ocean floor Kyle had known all his life. As they dropped into the mountain's depths, Chen continued her explanation with the detached tone of someone reciting well-rehearsed facts. The 1943 expedition wasn't accidental. We'd been tracking unusual electromagnetic readings from your island for months. When Dr. Marcus Holbrook finally made contact, what he found challenged everything we thought we knew about human development. The elevator stopped with a mechanical shudder. Beyond the opening doors lay a circular chamber dominated by a massive observation window. Chen led him toward it, her steps slowing as they approached. Kyle's breath caught as he looked through the window. Below them stretched another laboratory, but this one was different. Occupied. A dozen figures moved through the space with fluid grace, their movements eerily familiar. They wore the same simple clothing as his tribe, bore the same ritual scarification, shared the same distinct facial features. But these people were prisoners. "Oh my God," he whispered, pressing his palms against the glass. "Those are my people." "Volunteers," Chen corrected quickly. "Members of your tribe who chose to help us understand your unique genetic heritage. They live comfortably here, contributing to research that could benefit all humanity." One of the figures below looked up suddenly, as if sensing his presence through the one-way glass. Kyle recognized him immediately, Tavu, his cousin, who had supposedly died in a fishing accident 3 years ago. Their eyes met across the impossible distance, and Tavu's mouth opened in silent recognition. "You told us he was dead," Kyle said, his voice barely controlled. "The elders held mourning ceremonies. His wife grieved for months." Kyle watched as more familiar faces turned toward the window. Naya, the healer's daughter, Komu, barely 16 when he'd vanished during a storm. Others he'd mourned, their supposed deaths now revealed as elaborate lies orchestrated by his own grandfather. "The sacred prohibitions," he said, pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. "The warnings about leaving the island. They weren't protecting us from the outside world. They were protecting the outside world from learning about you," Chen confirmed. "At least, until we could fully understand what made your people so unique. Your grandfather was remarkably far-sighted. He understood that total isolation was unsustainable, but uncontrolled contact would be catastrophic. So you steal our people instead. Take them while we think they're dead. We study willing participants under controlled conditions. Every person down there chose to come here, chose to contribute to something larger than themselves." Through the glass, Kyle watched Tavu place his hand against the window, mimicking his own gesture. The pain in his cousin's eyes suggested his participation wasn't as willing as Chen claimed. "What happens when your research is complete?" Kyle asked. Chen's pause lasted a moment too long. "We'll have developed treatments that could eliminate genetic diseases, extend human lifespan, enhance natural healing abilities. Your people's gifts won't remain exclusive to your tribe. And my people, do they get to go home?" Another pause. Longer this time. "The research is ongoing," she said finally. "There's still so much we don't understand." Kyle pressed both hands against the glass, his reflection overlapping with the image of his imprisoned cousin below. The sacred isolation his people had maintained for generations hadn't been protection. It had been a carefully constructed prison, with his own grandfather serving as warden. The truth was worse than any contamination they'd feared from the outside world. Subject K-7 has reached the mainland as predicted. The isolation protocol has served its purpose. He carries no immunity to modern pathogens, making him the perfect vessel. Phase 3 begins now. The collected genetic material from his tribe will ensure our bioweapon targets only those populations we deem expendable. Subject K-7 will return home carrying our gift, believing he escaped detection. Within 72 hours of his return, the tribe will be extinct. Another successful field test complete. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Project Archipelago. The pages trembled in Kyle's hands. Every breath he'd taken since leaving the island, every surface he'd touched, every moment he'd spent in this place, he'd been exposed to something deliberate, something designed to kill his people. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible in the suffocating silence of the cabin. "No, no, no." He stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. The photographs scattered across the floor like accusations, images of his grandmother as a young woman, his father learning to hunt, children who'd grown old and died, all captured by hidden cameras that had watched them for generations like specimens in a cage. The terrible mathematics crashed down on him. If he'd been exposed yesterday, and the incubation period was 72 hours, he had perhaps a day before becoming contagious. The return journey to the island would take most of that time, even if he left immediately. He would arrive home just as the pathogen reached its most virulent stage. His legs gave out, and he collapsed among the scattered photographs. Faces of his people stared up at him, beautiful, trusting faces who believed their isolation protected them, who believed in the old stories about why they must never leave, never allow strangers to their shores. The stories hadn't been myths at all, they'd been warnings. Footsteps crunched on gravel outside. Kyle's heart hammered as he heard voices approaching, casual conversation between two people who clearly expected to find the cabin empty. "Should have triggered the proximity sensors when he arrived," a woman was saying. Her accent carried the crisp authority of education and privilege. "He's been here at least an hour," replied a man. "Plenty of time to absorb the full dosage. The aerosol deployment system worked perfectly." Kyle frantically gathered the most damning photographs and pages from the journal, stuffing them inside his shirt. He had to reach the boat, had to warn his people somehow, but first he had to survive the next few minutes. The door handle turned. They stopped short when they saw him crouched among the scattered evidence of their crimes. "Well," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice muffled by the mask but unmistakably pleased. "Subject K-7. You're even more perfect than we anticipated." Kale rose slowly, his mind racing. "You've been watching us for decades. 73 years to be precise. Your tribe has been invaluable to our research, a completely isolated population with unique genetic markers and zero exposure to modern diseases. You've helped us develop targeted bioweapons that could reshape global demographics." The casual way she spoke of genocide made Kyle's stomach lurch. The photographs. Documentation was essential. We needed to track genetic lines, population dynamics, cultural evolution. Your people lived such beautifully simple lives, never suspecting that every birth, every death, every ritual was being recorded and analyzed. The younger man shifted nervously. "Ma'am, he's seen too much. If he somehow manages to—" "He won't," Dr. Vasquez interrupted. "He's already infected, and he'll do exactly what his cultural programming dictates: return home to his people. The beauty of this approach is that the vectors always cooperate with their own destruction." Kyle's hand found the knife at his belt, the same blade he'd used to cut fish and prepare meals, now the only thing standing between his people and extinction. The weight of 73 years of surveillance, of manipulation, of his entire world being nothing more than a laboratory settled on his shoulders. But alongside the despair came something else, a burning clarity that cut through the horror like sunlight through storm clouds. They'd assumed he would follow the old patterns, make the expected choices, react as their data predicted. But standing in this chamber of horrors, surrounded by the evidence of their monstrous calculations, Kyle felt the last chains of the old world falling away. He was no longer bound by the rules of either civilization. "You're right," he said quietly, tightening his grip on the knife. "I will do exactly what my cultural programming dictates." Their eyes widened as they recognized their error a split second too late. The photographs scattered across the cabin floor like fallen leaves, each one a stolen fragment of Kyle's world. His hands trembled as he gathered them, seeing faces of ancestors he'd only known through stories. His great-grandmother as a young woman, weaving sacred patterns, his grandfather teaching children the old ways, ceremonies that were meant to be witnessed only by the tribe. But it was the journal that held the real horror. Today 847, The subjects continue to believe in their isolation. The feeding schedule maintains optimal population levels while preventing overcrowding. Today's harvest yielded 3 specimens for the mainland laboratories. Kyle's vision blurred. Feeding schedule, harvest, specimens. Day 1203. Introduced new bacterial strain through water supply. Mortality rate acceptable. The remaining subjects have developed interesting adaptive responses. Dr. Morrison believes we can accelerate the evolutionary process. His people weren't isolated guardians of ancient wisdom. They were lab rats. 2's Rimmun shows remarkable resistance to the latest pathogen. Have collected genetic samples during his sleep. This bloodline may hold the key to our immunity research. K47. Kyle realized with sick certainty that he was reading about himself. Footsteps on the cabin's porch made him freeze. Through the window, he saw figures in dark clothing approaching. Not the park rangers he'd expected, but people in military gear carrying equipment he didn't recognize. Target has breached containment, a voice crackled through a radio, moving to recapture. Kyle clutched the journal and photographs, his mind reeling. Everything was a lie. The sacred island, the ancient traditions, the isolation that defined their identity, all of it orchestrated by outsiders who saw his people as nothing more than test subjects. The door handle turned. Kyle dove through the cabin's back window, glass cutting his arms as he rolled into the underbrush. Behind him, shouts erupted as the soldiers discovered his escape. He ran deeper into the forest, branches tearing at his clothes, the stolen evidence pressed against his chest, as they've been watching us for generations. The thought pounded in his head with each footfall, every ritual, every birth, every death, all observed and recorded. The elders who spoke of maintaining the old ways had unknowingly been performing for an audience of scientists. A dart whistled past his ear, embedding in a tree trunk. Kyle zigzagged through the forest, using skills his father had taught him for hunting, skills that had been allowed to develop because they served some researcher's purpose. His communications device buzzed. Somehow, impossibly, a message was coming through. On Kyle, return immediately. The island is in danger. It was Elder Naya's voice, but how could she be reaching him? The device had never worked beyond the island's shores before. Unless they wanted me to have it. Unless this was always part of their plan. More darts flew past him. These people wanted him alive. Valuable genetic material wasn't worth much if it was dead. The realization gave him an advantage. He could take risks they couldn't afford for him to take. Kyle reached a cliff overlooking the ocean. Far in the distance, barely visible through the haze, lay his home, his prison. And somewhere between here and there, his people continued their lives, unaware that their every breath was monitored and measured. The soldiers emerged from the tree line, weapons trained on him but not firing. Their leader, a woman with cold eyes, stepped forward. "You've seen things you weren't meant to see," she said. "But that's all right. It's time for the final phase anyway." Final phase? Your people have served their purpose. The immunity research is complete. The behavioral studies are concluded. We have everything we need. She smiled, and it was worse than any storm Kyle had ever weathered. Tomorrow, the island will experience a tragic volcanic eruption. Very sad. The loss of such a unique culture. Kyle's knees nearly buckled. They were going to kill everyone. His family, his friends, children who had never done anything but live the lives their captors had scripted for them. "Unless," the woman continued, "you cooperate. Return with us voluntarily, submit to our remaining tests, and perhaps we'll find another use for some of your people. Laboratory technicians need assistance after all." The journal felt heavy in Kyle's hands. Generations of lies, centuries of manipulation, and now the choice between his freedom and his people's lives. But as he looked at the photographs scattered in his grip, images of his ancestors, who had unknowingly lived and died as experiments, Kyle made a different choice entirely. He stepped backward, toward the cliff's edge. "You need me alive," he said, but you need me cooperative more.